Perhaps, strangely for an autobiography, St. Augustine spends time on his infancy. But as we've suggested, this is a different kind of an autobiography. Yet how is it that Augustine can talk about his infancy? He doesn't remember it. None of us remembers our infancy. And why would he talk about it in anything resembling an autobiography? Well, in this, as in all things that Augustine talks about, you can be sure that he has something in mind. So let's start with where he starts. He talks about the fact that as an infant, he nursed. He needed sustenance from others. He says, "Neither my mother nor my nurses filled their own breasts, but you, God, through them, did give me the food of infancy according to your ordinance and your bounty, which underlie all things." Is it strange that Augustine goes to supernatural considerations when he and everybody knows and always has known that human mothers, like any member of the mammalian species, naturally feed their infants once they are born? Well, Augustine certainly understands that like anybody else does. He has an intention to go behind that and to think about it more deeply. He is struck by certain things. Why is it that on the moment of birth, a human mother automatically begins to provide sustenance, a gift of sustenance to this new infant? Augustine then says, "For it was you, God, who did cause me not to want more than you gave." So not only does the mother or the nurse give exactly the amount of food that the child needs, but the child's needs correspond to precisely that much which is given by the mother or the nurse. Augustine sees, as he so often does, order and intentionality in the way of nature. But here he's wanting to place a special emphasis on the fact that what the infant is receiving is a free gift. A free gift that comes through a mother or a nurse, but a free gift like all gifts, all good things, that ultimately come from God. So the beginning of his emphasis is on his receipt as an infant of a free gift from God. And then he wants to focus on how does any of us begin to respond to the gifts that we receive in this life. And so he's going to think, how do we respond to the first gifts that we receive in this life? He says, "Little by little, I realized where I was as I grew as an infant and wished to tell my wishes to those who might satisfy them, but I could not." So he realizes that an infant wants to say things, wants to communicate, but is unable to make signs like words, so flails about. He says, "So I would fling my arms and legs about and cry, making the few and feeble gestures that I could. I grew indignant that my elders were not subject to me, and that those on whom I actually had no claim did not wait on me as slaves. And I avenged myself on them by crying." That infants are like this, I have myself been able to learn by watching them. Well, strong language, talking about avenging himself. We might be inclined to think, Augustine, this is too much. You're saying that we sin as infants. Is he saying that we sin as infants? Indeed he is. He goes on, "Hear me, O God, woe to the sins of men. Who brings to remembrance the sins of my infancy? For in your sight there is none free from sin, not even the infant who has lived but a day upon this earth." So that's exactly what he's saying. He's saying that human infants are involved in sin. Before we tune him out, let's hear him a little bit more. The infant's innocence, he says, lies in the weakness of his body and not in the infant mind. "I have myself observed a baby to be jealous, though it could not speak. It was livid as it watched another infant at the breast." So what is the nature of sin that he's getting at here? He sees a jealous infant not wanting sustenance just to satisfy himself or to feed himself. He is actually wanting to displace another infant who has precisely the need that he has, to push that infant aside in preference for himself. Now, this is a natural phenomenon too, but Augustine sees that this jealousy, in this type of reaction, as well as all of these other things, the throwing of the bottles out of the crib when you're angry or whatever it might be, that these all set the stage for a life of sinfulness. He's talking here about original sin. He is giving examples of the doctrine of original sin. And by the way, later in the Confessions, the term original sin will be used for the first time in Christian literature by St. Augustine. But he's offering us examples right now of this. What is original sin? Original sin is a doctrine that suggests that our tendency towards self against others, our tendency to sin, we get at birth. We get actually in the Christian teaching at conception, and that it can manifest itself even in the smallest of infants. Now that may be a hard teaching. There was a modern writer, though, wrote about 100 years ago, who suggested that original sin is the only Christian doctrine that can be proved every day just by reading the newspapers. So this idea that there's something problematic in all of us, I think that people recognize. What's harder for a modern person to accept, I think, or get our head around, is the idea that it's not society that somehow distorts a naturally good and pure child, but somehow we all, even at our birth, have this tendency toward sin. So is Augustine declaring us all guilty of personal sin as infants? No, he's not. He moderates. I am loath to dwell on this part of my life, which, O Lord, I have no remembrance. But if I was conceived in iniquity and in sin, my mother nourished me in her womb. Where, I pray, O my God, where, O Lord? Where was I, your servant, ever innocent? But see now, I pass over that period, for what have I to do with a time from which I can recall no memories? He's actually saying, I do not accept guilt, personal guilt for those behaviors, but he is, with this story, giving us evidence of original sin and laying the groundwork for a life of a tendency to sin where we will grow responsible with our growing consciousness. We will become responsible. We will start committing sins, and we will enter a stage of sinfulness that we will never, none of us, depart on our own steam.